Hey everybody, in today's video, I want to give you 10 tips to become a better astrophotographer. This should not only improve the quality of your images, but also make your life a lot easier. Tip number 1, research your target thoroughly before you attempt to photograph it. This might seem obvious, but I know a lot of us get excited when we see a cool photo online. We think, wow, I really want to capture that. So you go outside only to be disappointed when you realize the target isn't even visible, perhaps you don't have the right focal length, whatever it might be. So there's 3 different things that you should do before you attempt to photograph any new target. First, use Stellarium, either on your computer or your smartphone. Because with Stellarium, you can search for the target and see where it currently is. You might discover that this is a seasonal target and it's already down for the year, and in that case, you'll have to move on and find a new one. Or perhaps you're too far north or south and the target's never really visible. Perhaps there's trees in your way, whatever it might be, Stellarium is a great resource for figuring this information out. Next, you'll want to use a website like telescopius.com, because on Telescopius you can enter your camera's sensor size and pixel size along with your telescope's focal length. Then with this combination, you could search for any target you want and see how it might appear. Very often what you'll discover is that your current telescope probably doesn't have enough zoom, let's say for Thor's helmet or something like that. And so what I like to do is go through, find a list of targets that I'm interested in, and check them out over on Telescopius. If I decide that there's 5 or 6 targets that are just too small for my current rig, well, now I know I might want to invest in a bigger telescope. Third, and most important, you want to use a website like astrobin.com, because on Astrobin you can find dozens of amazing photos of the target that you're trying to capture. And the best part is, very often the photographers will include the total exposure time that they captured, the filters they use, the telescope, and more. And that's why if you spend even 5 minutes on Astrobin, you'll gain a wealth of information that'll help with your planning. Once you have all this information, make sure you write it down in the notes on your phone. I like to have like an Astro target note where all the targets I'm interested in have the filters that I'll need, a rough amount of the total exposure time I should expect to invest, the focal length, and more. Then you can just consult that whenever you're ready to photograph a new target. Tip number 2, consider investing in a better telescope. Because if there's one thing that's going to cause you problems over the long run, it'll be a bad telescope. Whether that means it's difficult to focus, it has a heavy vignette, it's unwieldy to use, whatever it might be, if your telescope is causing you problems, then you're going to struggle both out there in the field and on the computer. And with so many telescopes to choose from, it can be difficult to find one that actually just works. That's why I'm a big fan of the Red Cat telescopes from William Optics. They're not paying me to say this. I don't really care what you buy. I'm just telling you that I've been using Red Cats for the last 5 or 6 years, and they really do make everything so much easier at night. First of all, the focusing is very simple. The Red Cats come with a bat knob mask along with a great focus knob, and in usually 60 seconds or less, I can achieve perfect focus. Plus, the Red Cat series are not very susceptible to poor back focus. And this is a common problem you're going to see with much more expensive telescopes, where if your camera is not at the exact right spot for the back focus, you're going to see star distortion. In fact, I was working with a student a couple months ago, and he spent a lot of money on a nice Pleiades telescope from William Optics, but he had distorted stars. And we're thinking, well, that can't be right. These are way more expensive than the Red Cats. How could they be worse? Well, it turns out his back focus was only about 1 millimeter or 2 off from where it needed to be, and that was ruining his images. Now, there are ways around this. You could buy one of these ASCAR back focus adjusters, but that's just one more thing you have to deal with every night. And for me, if I go with a Red Cat, I just attach my 2 spacers, the 16 and the 21, right to my camera, connect everything, and I'm good to go. I don't have to worry about the back focus nearly as much as you would with a lot of other telescopes. Another thing you should investigate is the rear diameter size of your telescope. Because if you have an older design, it might be M42 or maybe even something smaller than that. But let's say you have one of the new Duo cameras. Those have a much larger, like M54. So you can imagine if you have a little opening trying to illuminate a bigger area, you're going to have serious vignette problems. And even if you take flats, that's still not going to fix the underlying issue. But again, if you get a decent telescope that has a much wider rear opening, that's more light, that'll reach your camera, as well as your autoguider sensor, again, assuming you have one of the Duo cameras. Of course, I realize the economy isn't exactly great right now. That along with the tariffs, this is not exactly the perfect time to buy a new telescope. Still, my point here is just that if you're struggling with your telescope, just spend the money, get a better one, and I guarantee you it's going to make astrophotography much more enjoyable. Tip number 3, don't buy a full frame camera. This is mainly a problem, I think, with photographers who are into landscapes and wildlife and things like that, because in that world, a full frame camera is a great investment. But for astrophotography, it's actually usually not a good idea. And that's for 2 main reasons. The first is the large sensor size. If you have a full frame camera sensor, you're going to see all the problems with your telescope, your filters, and everything else, most notably in the form of vignette and star distortion. Even if you're taking flat frames, this vignette could still be a problem. And then you're stuck just cropping in the photo and you're losing the whole point of having full frame to begin with. The other issue with the full frame cameras is that they're often very high resolution. I'm talking 50 or even 60 megapixels or more. And while that might sound great, the vast majority of us do not need 60 plus megapixels. You're never really going to see a benefit from that. And in fact, it's only going to cause you problems because these files are going to fill up your hard drives a lot faster. They're going to take longer to transfer. They're going to take longer to stack and process. And unless you have a really good computer, it might seriously struggle to do even basic tasks with these high resolution images. With all that said, you're actually better off usually getting an APS-C camera sensor instead. These are usually cheaper, smaller, and the file sizes are much more reasonable. I'm a big fan of the 2600 line of cameras because these are really the sweet spot for astrophotography. You're getting about 26 megapixels, which is plenty. You get the APS-C sensor size, which automatically crops out the worst of the vignette and star distortion from your telescope. And if you have a decent telescope, you probably won't even see any problems with APS-C. On top of that, there's a lot of versatility in this line. You can go with monochrome, color, duo, whatever makes sense to you. If you can't afford the APS-C cameras though, I get it. There are cheaper options out there. These are, in some cases, much cheaper, but you're gonna have a smaller, lower resolution sensor, which might not hold up very well if you have to crop into the photo, or if you want to print out your images, they might not hold up as well as you would like. Still, they should work fine, and to be honest, I'd probably have a cheaper, smaller camera than a full frame, just because of the reasons I talked about earlier. Tip number 4, use the proper filter. This might seem obvious, but I get questions all the time about, hey, I want to photograph this target, which filter should I use? Or, I tried this filter and it didn't quite work. This actually ties back in with tip number 1. If you're using AstroBin, you'll know what filters to use ahead of time. The only question is, do you have the proper filter already in your collection? If not, you might want to invest in a new one. And to be honest, we could spend a whole video just on which filters to use for which targets. I might do that in the future. But what it comes down to is the specific target you're trying to photograph and also the amount of light pollution that you're shooting through. I would argue that if you're looking for a good all-around filter, one of the best would be the Optilong L Ultimate, which is a 3 nanometer dual band, which captures H-alpha and oxygen. This makes it perfect for a lot of different nebulae in the night sky. And the best part is it's going to cut out all the light pollution as well. Another thing you might not realize is that even if you're shooting from a dark sky, a filter can really help out. This is best seen with the Veil Nebula, because with no filter from a Bortle 2, even after a lot of exposure time, it still looked kind of soft and fuzzy without much detail. Then I put on the Optilong L Enhance, which is a cheaper filter than the L Ultimate. It does an okay job and the photo already looks a lot better. But when I throw the L Ultimate on there, now the image really comes alive because you're getting much more of the oxygen or the blue color throughout the nebulae. You don't really get that with the cheaper L Enhance. And that's why I'm suggesting if you get the Optilong L Ultimate or any other 3 nanometer filter like it, that should be good for probably 70% of the images that you want to capture. And then for the rest, let's say your galaxies or your dark dust nebula, whatever they might be, you're better off waiting until you can get out to a dark sky. Because if you use the L Ultimate for those targets, they're more broadband, and so you're blocking their light along with the light pollution. So to keep it simple, get a good 3 nanometer filter, photograph nebulae from your backyard if you're in a light polluted area, or even if you're in a dark sky, that would work great. Then when you get out to a really dark sky, maybe on a trip somewhere, you could do broadband targets like Andromeda or other galaxies, dark dust nebulae like the Dark Shark, things like that, and you don't really need a filter for those targets. Another thing I want to touch on briefly is doing SHO with a color camera. Because in the past you had to get a monochrome setup with a filter wheel, a bunch of filters. This could cost you upwards of $3,000. But now there's a new filter called the ASCAR D1, and there's also a D2. The D1, you've seen this everywhere. It's just a dual band H-alpha and oxygen. You don't really need the D1 if you already have that, like the L Ultimate. But the D2, that's where it's a bit different. The D2 captures sulfur and oxygen. And with this combination of H-alpha and oxygen plus sulfur and oxygen, you now have SHO for the Hubble color palette. So what I'd recommend doing is, let's say you capture 8 hours with your D1, L Ultimate, whatever filter you might have. Then you photograph that same target, same composition for another 8 hours or so with the D2 filter. Then you can stack your images separately, bring them into PixInsight, and in just a few minutes, you can have your SHO image with a little bit of extra work. That might be a great alternative, again, if you don't want to spend $3,000 and buy a whole monochrome setup. So I hope that explains filters. Again, I'd recommend L Ultimate or something similar, 3 nanometers. The only downside with these types of filters is that they're very dark. And the problem with that is if they're very dark, it's going to be difficult to see what you're doing in the ASIR preview, especially if you have one of the duo cameras. There will even be times where you can't properly focus because there's not a bright enough star. Then you have to stop your auto run, slew to a brighter star nearby, focus on that, and go back to your composition. So these filters aren't perfect. I mean, they have a lot of benefits, but there are some drawbacks. Keep that in mind. Do your own research, but most of the time you do want to have a filter on there for the best results. Tip number 5, always double check your focus. This is another common mistake I see people make where maybe they focus 2 or 3 times at the start of the night, they get tired, they go to bed, and then they wake up in the morning only to find that almost all their photos are blurry because the focus shifted. This really comes down to the temperature more than anything, which in some ways makes it easy to understand what you need to do. First, bring your gear outside at least an hour before you plan on shooting, if that's possible in your location. That hour will give your gear time to acclimate to the colder weather outside, because usually there's at least a 20-degree difference from inside your house to outside your house, especially during the winter. And the mistake that you could make is that you bring your gear out right when it gets dark, you start polar aligning and more, and then you're refocusing every 10 minutes because the temperature of your telescope is rapidly dropping. Whereas if you bring it out an hour ahead of time, this is not a concern. Another thing I like to do is check the weather forecast throughout the night. And if I see that the temperature is going to be static, let's say 32 degrees all night long, I know I don't really have to worry about the focus as much. Or perhaps the temperature is going to drop from 32 down to 10 degrees by 5 a.m. Well, now I know I either need to stay up all night long and check that focus, or I need to invest in an autofocuser, which will do it all for me. Because as the temperature cools down throughout the night, that will shift your focus. You need to make sure you're staying on top of that. Don't get lazy either, because some people, they might be looking at their iPads, but they're not zooming in. I see this all the time. That's why whenever I'm shooting at night, I have my iPad right next to me all night long, and I'm zoomed into a very small star, so it's filling the frame. And very quickly, if things get out of focus, I'll see it and I can fix it. I understand though that manually focusing can be a real pain, especially if you don't have the best telescope. This is where the autofocusers are becoming increasingly popular, because you can set it to autofocus every hour, after every 5 degrees Celsius, however you want to do it. It's all automated. The only problem with the autofocusers is that they take a lot longer. They can take upwards of 5 minutes to get through one focusing session, and that's assuming nothing goes wrong. On top of that, if you install an autofocuser, you can't really manually focus the telescope anymore. And for me, that's kind of a deal breaker, because in just 60 seconds or less, with the Red Cat scopes, I can be perfectly focused and ready to go. Whereas if I had the autofocuser, I know I have to wait upwards of 5 minutes for that routine to complete. And while you can manually focus in the ASIR with an autofocuser using some buttons, that's just going to take forever. Whereas if you had that nice focusing knob, it's much easier. So you can do whatever works for you. I'm going to continue manually focusing with the understanding that I have to stay up all night long, especially if the temperature's dropping. But then again, if the temperature's pretty consistent, I could probably take a nap and it won't be the end of the world. Before we move on, I want to touch on monochrome shooters for a second. Because if you have a filter wheel with 7 filters in there, every filter might have a different focusing position. The only way to know for sure is to put your Badnav mask on, zoom into a bright star, and take a preview test photo with each filter. If you're lucky and you've got a good set of filters, the diffraction spike will not change after each photo. This is true with the astronomic filters, which I purchased earlier this year. There's no focus shift whatsoever, even going from H-alpha to blue, for example. But if you bought some cheaper filters, like my older ZWO filters, in that case, the issue was that if I went from green to red, the focus might shift a little bit, or sulfur to oxygen, whatever it might be. So now there's just one more thing that you have to refocus on every time you do a filter change. So make sure you test that out and see how your filters perform. The main takeaway for this focus section though is that it really is temperature dependent, so make sure you always know what the temperatures are. Get your gear out at least an hour before you plan on shooting and watch it carefully, because there's nothing worse than getting to the computer the following morning, going through your images only to realize that the vast majority of the night was wasted due to your laziness. Tip number 6, keep your sensor clean. This is actually the most important tip in the entire video based on what I've seen, because I'll be working with people, they've captured great data, and then when we get to the actual editing, they've got dust spots all over their image. And even if you're taking flash frames, that dust is still there. So you're just putting a band-aid over the actual problem. You need to fix the underlying issue by getting a rocket blower. You can get these for like 10 bucks on Amazon or your local camera store. Get a nice headlamp or a bright light that we can see the dust clearly and blow off your sensor. This should only take you 30 seconds. If you have a monochrome camera that's bolted to your filter wheel, this will be a bit more difficult. What I've done in the past is just unscrew one of the filters from the filter wheel. That allows me to access the sensor and blow it out. You should be able to get 99% of the dust with that rocket blower. You don't need more than that. However, there will be instances maybe you have some pollen or something else stuck on the sensor. In that case, you might need to buy some sensor swabs. Just make sure you get the right sensor size. Then you'll take your swab, put a drop of the solution on there, rub it back and forth on the sensor, and you should be good to go. Now, 9 times out of 10, if you're seeing dust in your final images, it's because it was on the sensor. That's most likely the culprit. But you also want to check your filters if you're using them. Filters tend to get covered in dust along with fingerprints and anything else. Make sure you keep those clean. The final tip about keeping your sensor clean is to keep your gear connected and attached at all times, especially if you're just shooting around the house. Because every time you take your gear apart, that's a chance for dust to get in there. I mean, I live next to a dirt road. People drive by at night, it kicks up some dust. I also just leave the gear in a room where it can get fairly dusty, and I still don't have dust on my sensor because I'm not taking things apart. So if you're gonna be doing a lot of traveling, that's a red flag. Make sure you have your rocket blower and keep that stuff clean. Because while flats can fix it to some degree, again, you still have the underlying issue of a dusty sensor. That needs to be fixed as soon as possible. Tip number 7, watch the meridian flip, because this is by far the most dangerous time of the night. And if you're not careful, it could cost you hundreds of dollars and lots of wasted clear nights. The risk is that your camera is going from one extreme to the other. So it's gonna be almost horizontal here, and then gonna be horizontal over here. And as it's making that transition, if you don't have good cable management, a cable might get snagged on a hook or a screw or something else. This could very quickly destroy your camera, your mount, or your ASIR. In fact, just last week I had my own scary situation with the meridian flip. I went to bed, I woke up in the morning, and when I went outside, I realized that the telescope was not pointed where it should have been. Then as I looked closer, the ASIR was actually just dangling in the air, suspended by 2 cables. There was all kinds of problems. I'm still not quite sure exactly what happened, but I'm guessing that because I don't really have good cable management, at some point a cable got snagged during the meridian flip, and it actually broke off inside of my mount and inside of the ASIR. Thankfully, nothing was permanently damaged. I mean, I lost the cable, but big deal. Everything else still works fine. So this was a wake-up call for me. I mean, I've gotten very complacent with the meridian flips. I'm like, it'll be fine. And I almost just lost hundreds of dollars. And I've seen this happen to plenty of students where they go to bed, they wake up in the morning, and they've got a destroyed camera because they weren't watching during the meridian flip. A cable got snagged and it really ripped out the power port or the USB port, whatever it might be. This is why from now on, I look at the meridian flip time in the ASIR. It'll tell you, let's say 3:53 a.m., that's when your meridian flip is. I make note of that and I set my alarm for 10 or 15 minutes ahead of that. That gives me enough time to wake up, roll out of bed, throw on my shoes, go outside, and right when the meridian flip happens, I want to be out there ready to go. If I see that a cable is getting snagged or getting caught, I can move it out of the way. Worst case scenario, if something's about to go catastrophically wrong, just pull the power out so it doesn't go any further. You also want to make sure that your camera's not going to bang into the tripod leg or anything else. I don't want to seem too alarmist here, but this is the scariest part of the night, so make sure that you watch things carefully and prevent any problems. Tip number 8, use the correct gain. This one's very simple. Just go to the web page for your camera, scroll down until you see some graphs like this, and then look for HCG and then a number. This will tell you what your gain needs to be. In most cases, it's usually 100. Sometimes it might be 120 or 90. So spend a few minutes and figure this out for your camera. The reason you want to use this gain in particular is because if you go higher than the number, you're sacrificing dynamic range, especially in the highlights. If you go lower than this number, your photos are going to be much darker than they should be, and when you try to brighten them in post-processing, you'll very likely see sensor artifacts if you're not careful. But if you stick with that magic number, you should be good to go. The only time you'd really have to change this is if you're photographing something very bright like the moon. In that case, you might have to drop it down to gain 0 or gain 50. That way you're not overexposing that bright moon. But even if you're doing something like Orion, rather than lowering the gain, you're better off just shooting a faster exposure to preserve those highlight details. Tip number 9, turn on dither. This is an easy setting that can dramatically improve the quality of your final images. Frankly, I'm hoping most of you already know this, but I do see a lot with beginners who aren't really sure what dither is or what it does, and they're not even sure if they should turn it on. Well, you definitely should. The reason that dither is so important is because when you turn that on, after every single photo, your camera is going to move slightly to a different location, not more than a few pixels. The end result is that because your camera has moved around after every photo, then when the stars all get lined up to the same spot, the stacking software can see the hot pixels very clearly and remove them. It can also remove things like horizontal banding, sensor noise, and much more. So this is one of the easiest things you can do for a better quality final image. There are some caveats though. First, if you leave dither set to an interval of 1, it's going to do this after every single image. And that might be great in theory, but the reality is there's a settle time. Because if you think about it, the camera's moving, and you don't want to take a photo right after it moves because things are still kind of wobbly. You want to wait a few seconds. Now the settle time can take anywhere from 20 seconds to upwards of a minute. That means you're losing 20 seconds to a minute after every single photo. That's going to add up to a lot of missed time over the span of a night, over a week or longer. Therefore, I like to put my interval to 2 for the dither. That means it's going to move after every other photo, but as long as I'm capturing plenty of images, I still get the benefit of the dither without all the wasted time. Beyond that, you need to set the dither amount in pixels accordingly. This mainly comes down to your focal length of your telescope. If you're shooting with a large focal length, like 600 millimeters or more, then a pixel amount of 2 is probably plenty. On the other hand, if you're shooting a very wide field of view, like 200 millimeters, 2 pixels probably won't even be visible. You might want to do 5 or 10. This is something you'll need to figure out for yourself. If you're not sure, just put it to 2 or 5. That should work well, probably 75% of the time. Tip number 10, stay on top of your file naming. Because one of the issues I see is that people, they don't really pay attention to their file names at all. It becomes very difficult to stay organized, especially a couple months or a couple years in the future. What you want to get in the habit of doing is when you're setting up your auto run, you have the ability to change the actual file name there in the upper left. This will be embedded in every single photo that you take. The way I like to do things is put the name of the target, the filters that I'm using, and then the night. For example, California SHO1. I might abbreviate that to Cali, but still the same idea. Now I know at a glance that I was photographing the California nebula. I was going for the SHO or Hubble color palette, and this was taken on night 1. You gotta be careful though, because sometimes the auto run gets wiped out, that name. It might say FOV or some random star. That's why after the first photo completes, I like to go back into that auto run menu and just confirm the name is actually correct. Also, if you haven't done so already, you'll want to go into the advanced settings of your ASIR, look for this menu option in particular, and then turn on all the switches. This will embed the sensor temperature, the gain, and more into the actual file name. This can be very helpful when you're back on the computer. Maybe you don't remember what the gain was or the sensor temperature. Well, now it's right there in the file name. I know some of you are thinking, okay, big deal, my name wasn't correct, it's not the end of the world. And that's true, but this is really one of the big distinctions I see between advanced shooters and beginners. Beginners have no real good clear file names. Advanced shooters have everything very clearly laid out, cataloged, and organized. So make sure you're doing things correctly, and this will make things much easier on the computer. Well, before we go, I want to give you one final bonus tip, and that is to stack your images each morning. This is critical because if you encountered a problem the night before, you can identify it and fix it for the following clear night. In addition to that, you can also see how much data you're going to need for a clean photo. For example, recently I was photographing the California nebula with a monochrome camera in SHO. And to my surprise, after just 3 hours, the H-alpha channel looked good. I'm glad I had stacked my data the following morning, because if not, I would have thought I'd need another 5 or 6 hours of H-alpha, and that would have been wasted time that I could have put towards the noisier oxygen or sulfur channels. And that's why every single night I go out, I capture more data, Then the following morning, I throw all the data in one stack, restack it all together, and eventually I get to the point where I say, you know what, that looks good enough. I can finish up this image and move on to the next one. So that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to check out my deep space course as well. This has over 90 videos that take you through the entire astrophotography process, from picking your camera gear to setting up at night, troubleshooting, stacking, processing, and much more. This also comes with a companion PDF which I wrote, which is basically a book at this point, over 180 pages of additional information. I've also got a Patreon page if you're interested. That's where we go through and I explain the problems that I'm encountering, how to fix them. We do editing and much more. Finally, before we go, if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing that. We're almost at 100,000. I think it'd be pretty cool if we could hit that by the end of the year. I doubt it, but stranger things have happened. So that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.